Welcome to The Link Online. And we're back here in the studio once again after our wonderful adventure at the Salon de l'Immigration last week. And with us once again is the regular team. We have with us, drum roll please, Lynn Desjardins.
Hi there.
And Levon Savuns.
Hello there.
And on keyboards, Marie-Claude Simard.
Hi, everybody.
And in the control room, wondering what's going on in the studio and why we're making all these funny noises, is Chantal Saint-Sauveur waving to the crowds, except we have to get a camera in there. I don't know how. She brightens up the place. What can I say? But she's not on camera. All right, we've got a lot of interesting things going on in the studio today on the program. Levon, what are you going to talk about?
Well, I'll talk to a Canadian humanitarian worker about a call to G7 countries to raise $1.3 billion for girls' education.
Lynn, what about you?
I'll tell you about the provincial election result in Ontario and why it's important for Canada and for the rest of the world.
And recreational use of cannabis is a step closer to becoming reality in Canada, and the government, of course, will control it. But a new report says it won't end the black market in marijuana, at least not at first. I'll have more on that a little later on the program. In fact, we'll have all those stories and your comments to our stories as well, some of your thoughts. That's coming up on this edition of The Link Online. Well, the province of Ontario, the most populous province in the country, by the way, has elected a new government, and that'll have, of course, implications beyond the provincial boundaries. And Lynn, you have more on this story.
I do, Mark. Electors issued a resounding rejection of the Liberal Party, which had been in power for 15 years. Only 7 people from that party were elected, and that means the party will not have official status or the funding that comes with it. Now, what voters did do was elect with a large majority a conservative government headed by Doug Ford. Now, he's a bit of a populist. Doug Ford promised to slash taxes, reduce waste. He has pledged to stand up for the little guy. He has been compared to U.S. President Donald Trump, and there will no doubt be long discussions about that in the future. But why this is important for the rest of Canada and the world hinges on the makeup of the Canadian Confederation. As you know, we have a federal government, but also provincial and territorial governments which wield a lot of power. This can make it difficult for the Prime Minister of Canada to enact policy decisions such as those that he proposes to deal with climate change. So for more on this, I spoke with Jordan Press. He's a parliamentary reporter with the Canadian Press.
One of the key issues that Doug Ford talked about in the election was the environment. And in the sense that he was talking about, what do you do about carbon pricing? And he promised, for instance, to take Ontario out of the cap and trade system that they have with Quebec and California. He said, I'm going to pull Ontario out of that. And he also said there will be no carbon tax in my province if I'm elected premier. A carbon tax is something that Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, wants to have across the country. And he has said he is about to force it on provinces who decide not to do it. He's facing some opposition. But the opposition had largely been from smaller western provinces. Now you have the biggest province in the country with the leader saying, I am going to stop this plan of yours. And that means now the conversation that has largely been taking place in those smaller western provinces is now being brought to the most populous provinces in the country. So because Ontario is now going to be talking about it, potentially Quebec next door, which has to go to the polls to elect a provincial government in October, they are likely to be talking about it as well. It means that Justin Trudeau is also looking back out west towards Alberta, which is the home of the oil sands, and will the carbon pricing scheme that he is talking about, will that play a role in that election as well, and potentially when Albertans go to the polls next year? Is he going to lose an ally in Alberta, where he has Premier Rachel Notley, who supports his environmental plans? So what it means is that all this conversation this country has been having, or maybe the lack of conversation, I should say, about carbon pricing, about how to deal with environmental issues, and the federal government's climate change plan, all of that is now going to be brought up along with a lot of pocketbook issues, and maybe you could even call it populist light rhetoric. All of that is now going to just be fueled into more provincial elections, and then fuel the conversation when Canadians go to the polls to elect a federal government in October of 2019.
And I'm guessing that's going to make it difficult for Trudeau to try to meet its commitments to the Paris Accord.
it is going to be difficult for him to meet those commitments. There have been some questions already about whether he is going to meet those commitments in the first place. But yes, it is going to become more difficult on the Paris Climate Change Accord. It is going to be more difficult for him to convince, for instance, G7 leaders that he's trying to do this weekend in Charlevoix, Quebec, to make some changes to help, for instance, to remove plastics from the oceans, to recommit to the environment. In much the same way that he has an issue dealing with Donald Trump on the environment, now Justin Trudeau faces a domestic issue as well, that how do you meet those international agreements that you have promoted? How do you continue to be that progressive leader on the world stage when at home you are facing opposition to some of your plans?
And that was part of my conversation with Jordan Press, parliamentary reporter with the Canadian Press. Added that Ontario's premier designate may not be as supportive of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's plan to retaliate against U.S. President Trump's decision to impose tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. And Ford may make it more difficult for Trudeau to pursue some of his other international initiatives.
Yeah, I don't know that he's very much against Trudeau's stand against Trump and the initiatives. There was a comment just on the television before we came up here that he would support Trudeau in his stand against Trump. So maybe there's somebody.
But he's
see.
for $1 beer.
Well, who isn't? That is unlikely to happen, though, because let's face it, the beer is provincially controlled. The government, the provincial government, rakes in a huge amount of money on alcohol sales. And given the fact that Ontario is extremely heavily indebted after 15 years of the Liberal government, that he can't really do things like that when it's a valuable source of revenue for the province.
Well, and this was part of the big criticism of Mr. Ford, was that he never really came out with a concrete plan as to how he was going to pay for all these promises that he made. And of course, another criticism was that he wouldn't let reporters on his campaign bus, which is, the usual Canadian practice is that the reporters, and they pay for the position on the bus. But so what he did instead was he had his own staffer stand there like a reporter. She looked like a reporter and did a very positive report, and that was posted on social media.
Didn't he also hire actors to act as supporters during his campaign stops? So it's and for our international listeners, if the family name Ford sounds familiar, is because he is the older brother of Rob Ford, who was the internationally known mayor of Toronto. Got his notoriety after admitting that he smoked crack cocaine while in office, but also a very, very popular person in certain areas of Toronto suburbs, where they call it the Ford Nation.
Yeah. Yeah. He was very much considered a politician of the people, and his brother is sort of benefiting from that and continuing
on the
that
coattails.
Sort of, well, he's continuing the same mold anyway, and he doesn't
have experience. I mean, governing. He, I think, had one term as a city councillor, and there was also complaints from his family. He just launched a lawsuit. The late
widow.
The widow of the late Rob Ford says that he mismanaged the company and put the estate out millions of dollars. So it's going to be a very interesting 4 years.
Well, it's the culmination of an extremely interesting campaign. I mean, Doug Ford was not the original leader of the Conservative Party. The original leader, of course, resigned in a scandal. And we had the very unusual situation where the leader of the Liberal Party, Kathleen Wynne, right near the end said, "Oh, by the way, of course it's obvious I'm not going to win, so don't I'm backing out as saying vote for me because I'll bring you government."
And the New Democratic Party, which is to the left of the center, so the left, more left than Liberals, is now the official opposition. So you have it's going to be quite obvious who is, the stark choice between the policies offered by the Conservatives and the NDP. And, of course, in this election in Ontario, they have the first Green leader elected as well.
One seat. Not going to have much say in anything. And it's a majority, a very comfortable majority. Mr. Ford's going to be able to do a lot of what he wants.
As was pointed out in your story, of course, Prime Minister Trudeau has lost an ally in Kathleen Wynne, and now he's up against someone who says, I'm not on board with your policies federally.
Yes, and let's note that there is an election coming up in the province of Quebec, where the Liberal Party also is currently in power and may lose power, and he has a strong ally in the province of Alberta, where he has been able to get some support on climate, on carbon emission initiatives, and that premier may be going the way of the dodo bird as well. Not that I think she's a dodo, but what it means for the Prime Minister is that he may face losing support across the country, which is going to make it more difficult for him to act.
He's been going down in the popularity polls as well in the last while, quite a bit too. So we'll see.
It's because they're not showing enough of his socks. Did you see the socks that he was wearing at the G7? He wears good socks.
Oh boy! All right, we got lots more coming up. Well, Canada's efforts to legalize and regulate cannabis for recreational use is a step closer to becoming law after the Senate voted on the government bill and some amendments. A new report canvassing Canadian users suggested that the industry could be worth about $7 billion to the economy. Of that, about $4.5 billion would be for recreational use. About $1.5 billion would come from medicinal users, but that about $1 billion would still be going to the black market. Now, I spoke to Professor Emeritus Bill Bogart with the Faculty of Law at the University of Windsor, who has written on the subject, and we discussed the report and its implications, and the fact that the government legislation and regulation would not necessarily eliminate the underground market.
In the report, about 64% of present users say they will migrate to the legal one. So that, as an initial statistic, that's not bad. That being said, I think there are really three factors in terms of consumers that are critical in terms of persuading them to access cannabis in the legal market. I mean, one is price. The price in the legal market will have to be competitive with the illicit market. Price is important for any goods and services, and so, as I said, price will have to be competitive. The second thing is quality assurance. We have to drive home the message to people of, look, when you buy in the illicit market, you can't be confident of what you're getting. You could get cannabis that's contaminated. You don't know the strength of the strain. You may think you're getting something quite mild to just experiment with, and it turns out that it's very strong. And then the third thing is something that you alluded to, and that is effective access. As you and your listeners know, in Canada, retail sales of cannabis is going to be governed by the provinces and territories, and several models for doing that have emerged. But one thing that is critical for all of them is they're going to have to provide effective access, because if they don't, then those who want to use cannabis will be tempted to seek out the illicit market as an alternative. You're talking to someone who believes that legalization and regulation is the way to go. And I do that not because I think we should encourage people to use cannabis. It is not a harmless drug. There can be definitely negative consequences. We certainly have to protect children. Children should not be using this drug or any drug. But at the end of the day, criminalization has caused enormous problems. It's ruined people's lives because of a criminal record, simply because they've used this substance. It's given rise to this huge illicit market that is run by the criminal element. They don't pay taxes. They don't care about quality assurance. And we have not focused on what public health people call harm reduction methods. That is to say, persuading people to use drugs, whatever the drug, in the least harmful way possible. So I think legalization and regulation is the way to go. But as we're seeing, there are lots of complications. But at the end of the day, legalization and regulation causes a better set of problems than prohibition.
And that was an excerpt of my with Professor Emeritus Bill Bogart of the Faculty of Law at the University of Windsor in Ontario, and the full conversation is in our highlights section. Now we're going to move on and take a look at some of your comments to stories that we posted on the website. And a reminder, public commenting is open on all RCI stories. Just scroll to the bottom of each story to read the comments of others, and you can post your own there as well. Now, starting us off this week, of course, the G7 leaders are meeting near Quebec City, and we had a story this week about U.S. President Trump bringing up the War of 1812 in a testy phone call with our Prime Minister Trudeau. Ron Wilding has strong opinions on that.
President Trump has zero credibility. His words mean nothing because his knowledge base is severely limited and he is not grounded in reality. He knows zero about history. The fact that he thinks his allies are a security risk underscores the level of ignorance and lack of civility he carries. I hope our PM and the other world leaders don't tippy-toe around this bully. This from a guy who says global warming is a hoax. What next?
Now, we also have a new section on our website called Long Format, and this is for much more in-depth stories. And the latest one is about a language-disabled student who begged the court for assistance, and Shelley Deegan commented.
As a speech-language pathologist working in the field of augmentative and alternative communication, I have followed CDAC's many projects, and CDAC stands for Communication Disabilities Access Canada. Access to legal and justice services has been a long-standing project of CDAC. CDAC has been working to establish communication intermediary services for many years as part of this project. This is a very useful report which provides a legal framework for using intermediaries. And you can probably access it at, if you Google, Communications Disabilities Access Canada.
All right. We had another longer post from Barbara Collier, which explains a little about CDAC, and which reads in part,
"Thank you for this excellent article, which highlights the need for communications intermediary services in all police, legal, and justice situations. Communications Disability Access Canada, which is mentioned in the article, is not an Ontario program. It is a national non-profit organization that provides specialized training to speech-language pathologists across Canada to work as communications intermediaries in these situations. CDAC has a national database of 250 communications intermediaries, some in Quebec, that police, legal, and justice organizations can use to search for and engage in trained intermediary to facilitate a person with a communication disability."
All right, let's go back to the G7, sort of, at least in terms of the trade war between Canada and the U.S., in an article called From Ball Pens to Bourbon, a look at Canada's strategic tariff retaliation strategy. And Maurice Allery had this comment.
Steel and aluminum versus maple syrup and bourbon? An equal tit for tat, in my opinion. I should note, though, that Canada is imposing the same tariffs on steel and aluminum and then adding some more on a very, very long list of items, which includes bourbon and ball pens and tents and other things.
Oh, so it's going to cost us more money anyway. Now, we had a comment this week to a story from back in 2013 about the Festival 500 in Newfoundland, which was an international choir singing event, and Jack wrote,
I'm a former Maryland Boys Choir member who was on this trip. It was a lot of fun, and I'm happy to say that I maintain contact via social media with 3 of the 4 guys pictured. I'm very sad that the festival I was lucky enough to participate in has turned out to be the last of its kind.
Now, we had a story about a new T20 cricket league starting in Canada, and it's supposed to get underway shortly, but JJ wrote...
So, 0 tickets sold and no TV rights sold for a 3-week cricket tournament involving some of the world's most expensive players, starting at a place currently without a sitting in King City. Anything about this sounds unrealistic? Can anyone buy tickets now? No, of course not. They're not available. So where is the money to pay for all this coming from? Remember the fiasco at the Rogers Centre for the World 11 game a few years ago where none of the players or staff got paid or even reimbursed for their flights? The organizers did a runner after the game.
Now, we had a response from one of the officials of the T20, Vijay Settler, who wrote this.
JJ, we appreciate your interest, and come June 28th, look forward to debuting Global T20 Canada at Maple Leaf Cricket Club in front of thousands and millions around the world, as many of the world's best players showcasing the exciting T20 form of cricket.
All right, we'll end there. But again, if you would like to add your comment to a particular story, just scroll down to the very bottom of each story on the page there, and you can find the form to enter your thoughts. Well, as we've mentioned several times, the G7 summit is underway in Canada as we host the leaders of the various countries there. Most of the news coverage of this summit has been focused on the disagreements between U.S. President Trump and the other leaders, disagreements on trade, climate change, and the Iran nuclear deal. But there is one issue that all of the 7 leaders seem to agree on. And Levon, you've looked into this. Tell us a bit more.
Well, Mark, that one issue seems to be education for girls in developing countries or zones. And humanitarian and development agencies are hoping to capitalize on this. Earlier this week, they called on summit participants to raise $1.3 billion over 3 years for girls' education. They want Canada to contribute $500 million to that fund, again, over 3 years. For more on this, I spoke with David Morley. He's the president and CEO of UNICEF Canada, and I asked him, why this focus on girls? David Morley, thank you very much for taking my call.
Thanks very much, Lauren.
Now, UNICEF and several other NGOs are asking the federal government and other G7 countries to invest in education for, girls in conflict areas, poor girls. Can you give me more specifically, what is it that you want?
We're asking the G7 and we're asking for Canadian leadership to make an investment in girls' education, girls who are living in countries where there's crisis going on. These are some of the most vulnerable children in the world, most vulnerable people in the world. And so an investment in their education can really play an important part in breaking the cycle of violence, the cycle of conflict that their countries are facing. And we know that educating girls is a way to ensure that, that the children who eventually are born to them will be healthier, that they'll participate more in the economy, and that they will not suffer the same way from violence and early marriage themselves.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with David Morley. He's the president and CEO of UNICEF Canada. And by the way, we're expecting a big announcement on to see actually how much they're able to raise and whether Canada gets up to this occasion to really make a difference on an issue that can mark or make a huge difference in lives of up to 1 million girls and 2.7 million boys.
But they're asking Canada for this amount, but this is only a part of what the whole amount that they're asking from all the world leaders, right? It's over $1 billion.
So for all the G7, they want to raise 1.3 billion over 3 years, and they want Canada to contribute at least $500 million, but 500 million in Canadian. So it's a bit less. So the whole amount that they want to raise is 1.3 billion US, and they want Canada to contribute 500 million Canadian, which is about what I'm guessing $380 million US.
Yeah, the Canadian dollar's worth somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 cents right now, US, I think, something like that.
So,
and dropping like a stone. No.
Don't say that. Our investments are going down.
You have investments?
Well, one of the other things that they're hoping to get through at the G7 is the plastics, to try to get some kind of commitment or to devise strategies so that we can reduce the amount of plastic waste that's going into the oceans. Mm-hmm. I was speaking to an NGO that was saying it's a no-brainer. It's an easy one for all the leaders to agree to because the public everywhere seems to be becoming aware of this particular problem.
Yeah, I had a blog this week about the fact that here in Montreal they have now instituted, it's official, the ban on those extra light plastic bags that we all get at the grocery stores. So now you can't get them anymore, the extra light ones. If you want a plastic bag, it's a heavier one and you have to pay for it. And because it's heavier, they think you maybe will reuse it. And also in that story that I wrote about the plastic bags, there was a pilot whale that died, I think it was in Thailand. And when they opened it up for an autopsy, they found that the thing had like 80 plastic bags jammed in its stomach. So it either starved to death or died from internal poisoning of intestinal blockage. So
yeah, and Canada's Environment Minister has said that within a certain number of years that the plastic will outweigh the fish in the ocean.
Yeah. Well, but the thing is that a lot of environmental groups are criticizing Canada at the same time, saying that given that Canada wanted this to be a priority, Canada has been moving itself very slowly in banning plastic. So, for example, UK has just banned, certain things like straws, one-time steering sticks, and stuff like that, just to make sure that to reduce the amount of plastic garbage that gets thrown away. In Canada, we're still talking and consulting and. Nobody knows when these efforts will come to fruition.
Well, speaking of environmental stories, another one of my blogs was on the fact that there's logging of these ancient forests on the West Coast still, and there was it's a sad story. I mean, these are the biggest, oldest living creatures on Earth, and some of these environmentalists just found out that one of the trees logged was the 9th largest tree in all of British Columbia that they cut down. They're not supposed to cut these big trees down. There's a sort of a policy saying when you come across these extra big trees, don't cut them down. Now, this thing was somewhere about 800 years old, and one of the comments from the people was, one of the comments from the environmentalists of finding this said, there are less than 1% of the old-growth Douglas firs on the coast remaining. It's like finding a huge black rhino or Siberian tiger that's been shot. There are simply too few today, and logging the last of these giants shouldn't be allowed to happen anymore. So imagine this tree, 66 meters tall.
Wow.
That's like it's almost a 20-story building tall.
Yeah.
It's just incredible.
Yeah.
Lynn, what about one of your stories?
Oh, speaking of whales, I had a story about scientists and volunteers who unearthed a whale carcass that they'd buried for 3 years. It was a gray whale that had washed up on the west coast of Canada on Vancouver Island, and authorities had the choice of dragging it back out to sea or burying it. Now, by putting it in the ground, nature took its course and scoured the bones, which can now be studied for clues about how whales are doing in these times of climate change.
All right. Now, Levon, you have a minute to talk about your story.
We talked about Lynn's long read story in our letters, and I'm preparing to publish one on Saturday about this very controversial monuments to this Ukrainian Nazi collaborators in Canada. So a monument to a Ukrainian national hero who also collaborated with Nazis, and 2 monuments to the veterans of the 14th SS Waffen SS Galicia Division also known as the First Ukrainian Division. So, and it's been raising a lot of controversy
No
because
doubt.
this is being, of course, used by Russia for propaganda purposes. And I spoke with some historians to get a bit of the context about why these monuments were created and why some people in the Ukrainian diaspora in Ukraine still consider these people to be important people to be commemorated. So
We're having a lot of trouble with statues in this country.
yes, we're going to have a lot of, I'm guessing, a lot of angry letters from Ukrainians.
We still have the controversy about the victims of communism, I think, statue they want to put in Ottawa. And we've had the statue of Cornwallis removed, and we've had recently the Queen Victoria statue defaced here a couple of times in Montreal. So statues, interesting things.
Yep.
All right, that's about all the time we have for today. So I hope you enjoyed the show. And of course, as always, you can write to us and give us your thoughts on any story. Now, for Lavon and Lynn and Marie-Claude and our technician Chantal, I'm Mark Montgomery. Take care until next time. Bye-bye. Now we got to figure out which camera it is, right?